Late August 1922. Though he was tired, Thomas Barrow could not sleep. He had left the Cavendish immediately and walked to the station at Cambridge to head for York and thence to Thirsk for Downton. Milo was back in Downton. That was good. She had left her work, however, and with no word to anyone, gone missing. Let's hope she is well enough now, at Mrs. Crawley's home, for that was where Lord Grantham, who had called Rutherford himself, had said she was now. There was another thing that was concerning him, however, and this was to do with Tom Branson. Though they were both Irish, it was clear, very clear, that he and Jack Prue did not get on, and he was trying to determine to what extent, and also why. So wrapped up in his thoughts, Thomas did not notice a woman coming towards him until it was too late. He made to step out of Edna Braithwaite's way, but the former Downton maid did not move, and Thomas was shocked to see her face, though reasoned that she probably deserved it for one reason or another. "Mr. Barrow," she exclaimed, brushing her cheek with her gloved hand, then added hastily, "I think it is a good idea if we talked." "Well, I don't," Thomas told her, stalking past the woman, but then stopped and turned when he realized she was following him. "Why don't you just go away?" "Because I know what happened to cause your wife to run away." "Lies," he determined, "so if you don't mind." But Thomas broke off when the woman did not protest. She simply stood on the platform, staring after him. And suddenly, much to his own surprise, Thomas found he felt sorry for the scheming witch. She looked thin as a rate and had clearly fallen to hard times, which was to be expected, leaving without a reference as she had done. He had known what Tom Branson had done with her, though she had set it up. "I am not lying, Mr. Barrow," she said, quietly. "I know what happened to Miss Ashby." But Thomas was not ready to believe just anything, and he stopped and gave her a mocking smile. "Ivy Close is a simple, uneducated girl," said Thomas, "and she put it better than anyone when she said that you lie all the time. So how can we know if anything you say is the truth?" "Because if I don't tell you, my conscience will only be satisfied if I tell the police." She sighed heavily. "I'll get into trouble, I know it, but what he did ... I cannot ignore it." "Your conscience?" Thomas made to scorn, and then he stopped. "He who?" he asked. "What did he do?" And Edna laughed at Thomas's ignorance. "What you cannot," she laughed. In his vile way, for whatever reason, he made her a woman, and Edna took a step towards Thomas. "And all you offered her was a telling off." "The great Mr. Barrow." "Shall we talk here?" he asked. "Not here." "Not anywhere." "Somewhere we cannot be overheard." So Thomas Barrow walked with Edna Braithwaite from the Downton platform and down the lane that took them to the village. And once she had told him, Thomas thanked her, and continued his journey over the field and towards the church, on a path that took him a longer, but more secluded way back to Downton Abbey. There was anger in him now. He thought he had thwarted Branson, but he had done this to Milo. She never said. But, it was true what Edna Braithwaite had told him. Lady Mary had decided what was true, and either of them had given Milo a chance. He was as much to blame than anyone, more so, in truth. And because she had been able to account word for word what had transpired, Thomas could not doubt the rest of her story, that she had broken in to get to Branson, secreting herself upstairs, unwitting witness to a vile act. When he next saw Branson, broken, White Lily holding son-in-law of Lord Grantham, Thomas Barrow was going to kill him. 88,888,888. But by the time he got to the ridge of land between Downton village and the Abbey, Thomas had turned back. Sleep deprivation and distilled anger were keeping him from thinking straight, and he remembered that Lord Grantham had said that she was at the Crawley house. But by the time he had got there, and spoken to Mrs. Crawley, Thomas realized he might be too late. "Mr. Barrow, I don't know where she is," Isabel Crawley admitted. "Her things are here, should you wish to see them." "Can you come with me, Mrs. Crawley?" "I should not want anyone to think I have acted inappropriately." Isabel Crawley looked at the carriage clock on the mantel in the hall, then glanced upstairs. "Why would anyone think that, Mr. Barrow?" But he was already taking the stairs two at a time, and it struck her of her suspicion about Milo's health. By the time she had got to the guest room door, Mrs. Crawley was witnessing a careful interrogation of all of Milo's things. "What are those?" she asked, when she saw he had something in his hands. 2 letters, including one detailing the sale of Milo's brother's belongings, electrical equipment, metal, tools, and so on. "Mr. Hamborough, York," he told Mrs. Crawley. "And the lease agreement witnessed by your son, Mrs. Crawley, and Isabel Crawley looked at them both, including the sale. This has to be a mistake. Of course the Sparks can't just sell these things. Especially, Thomas prompted. "Something," Mrs. Crawley replied. "Something and nothing. I think it best coming from Dr. Clarkson. Will you wait until she returns? I can organize tea and cake." But Thomas shook his head, adding another intrigue to his mental list. "I have to get back to Downton for the bazaar." He broke off, and smiled to Mrs. Crawley. "She has chosen to come to you, Mrs. Crawley, so that tells me something." "So where is she now?" And that was the question. When Isabel Crawley did not reply, Thomas nodded and thanked her, before turning out from the front door onto the path beside the gate. "I do hope when you find her, you will give her my congratulations for the day." Congratulations? Thomas wondered what on earth Mrs. Crawley meant, and it took until he was within half a mile of Downton for the penny to fall, their anniversary. He and Milo had been married for 2 years. Then Thomas picked up the pace and tore past the half-assembled bazaar stalls and into the yard at the back of the kitchen. "I am afraid I can't come now, Cousin Isabel," Lord Grantham told her, when she called to Downton to speak to him urgently. "We are just about to sit down to dinner. But it is gratifying to know she is with you, and Mr. Barrow is on the way back here." He put down the receiver, oblivious to the continuing conversation coming from Mrs. Crawley. "She has come back to the village. She is safely with Cousin Isabel," he told them all, sitting down to luncheon at last. "Well, that is something," Cora said. "I will send a message to her grandmother. She must be worried sick." "And Barrow is coming back here?" Tom Branson asked. "He has found her then. She is at Crawley House. That is all I know," Robert Crawley told his son-in-law, "and hence, the rest of the family and the serving staff." "I'm pleased," said Mary. Edith gave her sister a scornful look. "I don't know why, you're always thoroughly horrid to her, especially the last time." Mary Crawley smiled glassily at her sister. "I mean to apologize." "Now, Mama, about the bazaar. What thrills have you for us all this afternoon?" 88,888,888. Thomas got to the back of the kitchen door, and rested a hand in it. He could hardly believe what Edna Braithwaite had told him. But that was not the most important thing just then, finding her was. And he pushed the door open, stalking in, enveloped in the unusual noise of unusual from the kitchen, which stopped abruptly as he got to the doorway. Several pairs of his colleagues' eyes were on him. Thomas looked around at them, but said nothing. He turned to go. "Did you see that?" asked Daisy, of Mrs. Patmore. "Doesn't he look pale?" "I mean paler than usual." "Mr. Barrow?" Thomas stopped and turned on his heel. "Yes, Daisy, I am Mr. Barrow. Do you have a question that you want to ask me?" She shook her head, mutely, and then he saw everyone was staring at him again. "Are we done with the food for the bazaar?" he asked. "And all the arrangements?" "I was under the impression that there was still 2 marquees to get up and the raffle prizes." "And Milo." Daisy didn't mean to be so outspoken, she told Mrs. Patmore later on, and she had waited for Thomas Barrow to shoot her down. But instead, he dipped his head and sighed. "You all know she went missing?" Several heads nodded. "Milo is supposedly back in Downton, but where, I do not know." Beside the piano, at the back of the room, Mr. Molesley simmered on the edge of the conversation. "Mr. Barrow?" He spoke up. "I think, perhaps I do." 88,888,888. But that had been an hour ago, when Milo had collected what she needed to take down the transmitter. As she climbed, the sounds of people congregating at Downton got to her ears, and she looked in the direction of the big house. And an anger overcame her, an anger at the Crawleys, at Lady Mary, at Thomas. How dare they threaten for it to be torn down? But Milo, remembering Rutherford's words, had resisted showing it, which had made Thomas cross with her. He had never been cross with her, ever in her life, like he had been when she had the lease of her own house in her hand. Which is why she had struggled to think of something to say. She climbed one foot onto the metal rungs of the fixed ladder, and what does someone say after being violated? Another foot. Milo hadn't screamed, although she ought to have, but she knew that Lady Mary would accuse her acting like an infant, or disturbing the happy home. No one had listened, and Milo hadn't found a way to get either to listen to her. And that transmitter needs to come down, Thomas had reiterated, to the retreating back of Milo. He had stood there, on the servants' stairs, and glared down at her, amused, almost, at her distress. So she had gone immediately to the church, but could not gain entry. The materials belonged to her anyway, but, of course, the Sparks had dictated to sell her things on. Milo knew this because she had visited once and the quantity of objects in the outhouse storage had diminished. Worse, she had seen an electric iron in the Downton kitchen, and when she had asked Mrs. Hughes where it had come from, she had told her Ripon, whereas Milo knew, from the tool marks at the top, where she herself had held it in a vise as she had unscrewed it, and then screwed it back together again. And so it might have. But that iron was Milo's own design, not an appliance sold in a catalogue. It was unique. So logic dictated that it could only have got to Ripon if Mr. Sparks had given it, or more likely sold it, to the dealer. No one had listened. No one had listened when she told them that Mrs. Sparks would not let her in, or when she had found bed linen belonging to her mother thrown onto a scrap pile which Mr. Sparks was in the process of burning. No one had cared. Well, one person had. Jack Prue, who had comforted her, and listened to her. He had been canny enough to have left her grandmother's business ticking over in hands of his associates. Good thing too, now the overseas markets were all but closed to them at the outposts of empire, and America had just implemented prohibition. At the top of the spire now, Milo could see, just about, people in groups on the fields of Downton, presumably at the bazaar of Lady Cora. Behind the Abbey a dark could had accumulated, made darker by the sun behind her shining onto it. She sat at the top of the spire, on a small ledge, looking at her copper fixings, the transmitter still in place, green oxide forming at the joints. And in her mind, Milo ran through the day before Branson's attack, thinking how he had always seemed so nice. But was he really? He was nice to her face. But when he had been drunk, and he surged after her in the generator room ... that hadn't been nice at all ... What are you trying to do? He has asked her, when she was fitting the transmitter to the church spire. He had been behind her as Milo had looked up from ground level and had joked with gentle laughter about how long it would remain up the for. Come on, I'll take you back, Tom Branson had told her, when she was finally ready that day. And she had accepted, but it had been the station she had wanted to go then, and Manchester had been her destination. Mr. Branson, I'm not Irish, Milo had told him, when he had insisted yet again that she was. Can you tell me you understand that? Had he known all about the guardianship then? He must have had his brother's letter. It was after Milo had got married to Thomas. Why was Milo being Irish important to him? You've been worrying about that all this time? He had asked her. Then followed up with, but of course you're Irish. And it was that insistence that had stuck with Milo. Was it something to do with his title? The baronetcy of Inishquin. Milo hung her head and thought about the lease, as a few heavy spots of rain fell on her, and the surrounding stonework. All she had ever wanted was the lease to her house, that she knew Matthew Crawley and Mr. Sparks had signed, which she had now. Milo had just needed to be assured the building was hers. The rain was growing heavier. Drips were running off the cables of the transmitter, and Milo began with unscrewing the counter which had recorded the frequencies transmitted and, hopefully, received. A shout came from the churchyard below, and Milo just about caught the end of the transmitter cable as corrosion from being exposed to the weather had caused them to weaken. The shout came again and Milo looked over the edge. The figure was waving to her. Thigh underrumbled, far off, terrifying those of a weak disposition over towards Ilkley, and she backed away. 2 more bolts came away as Milo held the transmitter in both hands. Another call from below made Milo look, and she leaned over, her foot catching the transmitter's cable, it pulling along out of all its fittings. And Milo fell.